Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. I'm super honored to have here today Nick Campion. Nick is known as one of the world's leading historians of astrology. He is the author of a series of books, including the definitive two-volume history of Western Astrology, published by Bloomsbury. He's an associate professor at the University of Wales, Trinity Saint David, where he's director of the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology and Culture, and renowned distance learning master's degree in cultural astronomy and astrology. Nick has a lifelong passion for the many ways in which human beings describe, represent, and engage with the stars. Nick, thank you for being here. Such a pleasure.
Thank you, Denise.
Nick, have we ever stopped engaging with the sky and the stars?
Yeah, I think in the modern world we have. I mean, if we go back to cultures before the modern period, then they all engaged with the sky somehow. I mean, you had to, because if you had to wait until it was light to wake up and get up, you had to wait until the sun rose. You know, and when the sun set, it went dark and all sorts of life activities ceased. So, you know, the sky is fundamental. But I do feel that now in modern urban life, people unfortunately do forget the sky. You know, in a world of artificial light, then most people are hardly aware of the visual sky at all. They'll never see a single star, and they probably don't even see the moon that much. So I think it's a tragedy of the modern world that so many people have lost a visual connection with the sky.
Yeah, and it's so inspiring, isn't it? So we love it. Nick, the guys in the channel, my audience, I have the honor to be a student of Nick. He's my professor at the master's degree in cultural astronomy and astrology. Has been such a transformative journey. And Nick, when we spoke about this interview, I thought of, you could elaborate a little bit this amazing journey of taking astrology back to the academia. So I ask you, how many years have passed since it's not in a formal academia degree, and how was it? It was such a journey.
Well, I mean, let's start by going backwards in time for a bit, because the MA started in 2002. Before that, briefly, there was a degree taught in the history and culture of astrology at Kepler College in Seattle that I was a part of. And then my own journey in the history of astrology really began about 1980, when I'd studied astrology as far as I could go, and I began to actually become more interested in the diversity of its claims than in astrology as a single phenomenon which you could use or practice. I became aware of its sheer variety and then its historical lineage. And so I just became fascinated by its development as far as we can trace it back through different phases of history, right down to the present day. So, I mean, my two loves really are the sky in all its forms, whether it's astronomy, whether it's astrology, whether it's paintings of the sky, celestial art, whether it's science fiction, and then history, because for me, history is, some people said, the queen of the academic disciplines, because it tells you where everything came from. So the history of science, history of art, whatever. So it's the story of how we got to where we are now.
Do you think we neglect the study of history in astrology?
I think, yeah. I mean, the big question, we neglect the study of history altogether. And I think many of the problems in the world, like political problems, are the result of people not understanding the past, and also the past of other cultures. So the history of astrology. So, I mean, my justification for that, apart from my personal interest, is that astrology is a very important part of popular culture, and it sort of achieved that status in the modern world, in modern times, in its current form just over 100 years ago, and now it's a global phenomenon. So, you know, the study of history, it used to be all about the study of great men and wars and battles. And then in the sort of second half of the 20th century, people started saying, well, we have to study the history of working people. And then people said, well, the history of women. And then, I don't know, queer history, and then the history of everything. And so that was the context in which we set up the program in the early 2000s, was by saying, well, there's all these different histories now, and astrology, as this really important part of modern culture, needs its own history.
And I imagine how difficult it is to select what to teach, right, Nick? It's so wide. I keep thinking about how, you know, how you guys select the subjects. It's super wide.
It is difficult, but what you've got a negotiation between the course content, the kind of modules or classes that students select, and the requirements of the university, right? So we've got the university, which itself is governed by UK government regulations. Okay, so that dictates a lot of the range that we can teach. So we can't teach everything, right? So we select, and some things get dropped along the way. For example, you know, we used to teach a module on astral religion that dealt with history of planetary deities and religious calendars and pilgrimage. So, you know, everything was restructured. We had to drop that. So we focus on history and anthropology. Okay, so history is studying the past, but studying the past up to present day. Like, you know, if you're looking at the history of astrology, you can look at the history of Babylonian clay tablets, or you can look at how astrology is now spreading through social media and apps and so on. And, you know, it's part of modern history.
Yes.
And we also do anthropology, right, which means looking at people. And so we teach students how to talk to people, including astrologers, but also, you know, astronomers, or people who aren't either astronomers or astrologers but have got opinions about astronomy or astrology. So we teach students how to talk and listen. You know, how to talk to somebody and understand what they are really trying to say. So we get students doing wonderful work exploring attitudes to the sky from modern perspectives. And, you know, so we do, you know, look at the whole sky. So we've got students who look at issues like the ethics of space exploration, or the problem of light pollution, as well as looking at the development, say, of modern psychological astrology as a particular kind of astrology. So, well, as I say, if it's to do with the sky, then we will find a space for students to study it, do some research into it, or, you know, as they do.
What I think it's extraordinary is because astrology still has this stigma, right? Back to taking it back to academia in a formal approach, right? With the formality and rigor of the university. So how hard was it for you to, when you envisioned and to make it happen? Because it's such a such a different thing when you think about it.
Actually, it wasn't that hard at all. For me, right? My route was a fairly easy one, and I agree that amongst many people of a certain kind, astrology has a stigma. I mean, for most people, right, the majority of the population of the average, Western country, I think, or South American country, or people just accept astrology as part of their lives. They might casually glance at a magazine or something that talks about their birth sign. It's not an issue.
Mhm.
Some people it is an issue, and they get very upset about astrology because they think it undermines modern civilization. So, I mean, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But as a historian, I still need to study it. If something undermines modern civilization, you still have to study it. So anyway, the path for me was that I decided to return to the academic world in 1996 and applied to do a PhD. And the first university I applied to was my very big city university, where I applied to work in the history department. There's a little series of steps. The history department, even though I had a great supervisor who wanted to supervise me, history department said, well, this topic, because I was looking at modern astrology and belief in it, this topic, sociology. In the sociology department, there was nobody to supervise me. So I got sent on to a tiny little university called Bath Spa University, where they had a wonderful study of religions department, where they specialized in studying New Age topics and contemporary pagans. So I went along there and I said, can you take me on to do a PhD? They said, yes, fine. When can you start? Completely different reaction to the big university. And then, so I then, as part of that academic process, I got involved in this emerging other little academic discipline called cultural astronomy, which is, the study of any kind of astronomy in relation to culture. In fact, it often focuses on the ancient world, what they call ethnoastronomy, which is astronomy in indigenous cultures, or archaeoastronomy, which is the study of astronomy in relation to ancient sites like Stonehenge. So I got involved in that. So I then developed this twin track, right? Cultural astronomy and the history of astrology. So then I started doing bits of teaching at the university in study of religion, sociology of religion. So that often happens if you're a PhD student. And then I got offered some private funding from a body called the Sophia Trust. And I proposed that we create the MA, and I was had these two areas, cultural astronomy and astrology. So we just called the MA Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. And there was no problem. There was a little bit of, I think, unhappiness amongst teachers of cultural studies. And that's because the cultural studies area attracts people who are kind of left wing. And they're the kind of people who in sociology have encountered the idea that astrology is it kind of undermines civilization. And to me, again, that's a silly thing to say, because sociologists have to study anything to do with society. You can't say, oh, we're not going to study this. So that was my route. And then we taught physical classes. And then the course became economically unviable. So I had to look around for another university. We went off to we found the university in the far west of Wales, a little town called Lampeter. One marvelous, magical little town.
Marvelous, beautiful.
And yeah, and so we set up there doing distance learning, because because you've got always, other external pressures like distance learning can be much more economically viable because you spread the number of students who can actually study. And I actually really like that anyway, because it's inclusive. We've got
Yes.
people like yourself, we've got people in China, students in South Africa, Russia, anybody can study. And so now that university is the University of Wales, Trinity Saint David, and that's where we continue to flourish.
It does work, right, Nick? And one thing I think it's interesting to our audience here is you don't need to be an astrologer, right, to do the MA. Like, if you could explore that, because the cultural approach to astronomy and astrology. So anyone is.
No, I guess that about 2/3 to 3/4 of our students have a background in astrology of some kind, but that can be very slight. Or they're, long-term practicing professionals. So the other third to a quarter have a primary interest in astronomy and no interest in astrology. So there's this shared concern with the sky, you see, and that kind of comes together in quite a few of the classes. For example, in one of the compulsory modules, all the students have to keep a sky journal. So we get them to observe something in the sky for a month, and then they can look at their personal responses to it, take photographs, draw pictures, write poems. They can consult other, poetry and literature about that phenomenon. They might be looking at, say, the planet Venus, if it's a time when Venus is visible, or they might be looking at the sunrise. And this can go very broad. Like, we had a student in Goa who wrote a project during the monsoon, so it was raining. And where does rain come from? The sky. So it's a sky phenomenon, clouds. So that kind of exercise, it's new to astrologers and it's new to astronomers, but the shared focus is the sky. Because most practicing astrologers don't know much about the sky, and if they do, rather than being, from my experience, I've had experiences where there may have been a brilliant full moon or a brilliant new moon, and the astrologers start talking about what zodiac sign it's in. For me, as a lover of the sky, that instantly starts to disenchant the phenomenon. And a lot of astronomers, similarly, they now spend their lives reading printouts of data from a quasar or a pulsar or something. So we're great evangelists for bringing people back to the visual sky, which is, after all, it's by looking at the sky that both astronomy and astrology originated.
Yeah, it's such an exercise, such a journey. I often paste in my Instagram, Nick, the sun rising and the sun setting. It's just this connection of, with the sky all the time. Nick, do you think, changing a little bit the subject, linking somehow with what we're saying, do you think that maybe astrology haters, they might hate it because of fate and free will dilemma somehow, that maybe people cannot stand the part of our lives might be subjected to fate? And another question linked to that, can we negotiate fate?
Okay, so I think the astrology haters, as you put them, have misconceptions about astrology. They think that astrologers think that the stars rule their lives. Okay, so that's a misconception, because a fundamental feature, in my view, of the entire tradition of astrology is that it is designed to encourage some sort of choice or freedom of action. Right? And this statement goes right back to one of the great astrology texts, foundational text from the 2nd century, written by Claudius Ptolemy, a Greek, lived in Alexandria in Egypt. And this text, the Tetrabiblos, is a foundational text for Western astrology. And in one part of it, he says, he's talking about the Egyptian temple priests, and he said something like they would never try to heal the sick if they did not think the future could be changed. Right? So there's an example from medicine. Right? If you're a doctor and somebody comes to you and they're sick, you don't just say, oh, they're going to die. You treat them. Right? So that was his metaphor for astrology. It's absolutely fundamental that the future can be changed. Now, in astrology, how far can the future be changed? You know, some people think it can be changed a lot in terms of events. Other people think that you can only change your own internal responses to what happens. So, you know, you have a disaster, you can decide how to react to it. And that's in Western terms, that's a Stoic point of view. In Indian terms, it's a Buddhist point of view. So astrology's attitude to fate is actually quite subtle, and it also is varied. Now, as against that, in the scientific world, there are a lot of absolute determinists who think that there is no freedom of choice. And I was watching recently a very interesting interview on YouTube. There's a YouTube channel called Trigonometry, which is fantastic. It's in English. And one of the main interviews is a man called Konstantin Kissin, and he was interviewing Richard Dawkins, who is, you know, a great, well known as a critic of all things alternative in quotation marks, including astrology. And the question was about free will. And Richard Dawkins, a very famous, well-known popularizer of science, said he did not believe in free will. So Konstantin Kissin said, you think everything's determined? And Richard Dawkins said, well, kind of, yes. And Konstantin Kissin said, what, even your response to this question is predetermined? And Richard Dawkins said, well, kind of, yes. You know, you can find that debate on YouTube. So it's not that astrology haters are opposed to astrology because it's fatalistic, but because they think astrologers are stupid. Because the language of astrology to the uninitiated sounds a bit weird. So, you know, to the uninitiated, you might hear an astrologer saying, Venus is trine Neptune and Mars is squared Saturn. So this is a good moment for falling in love. But you probably got to watch out for unexpected accidents. Okay, that's a reading of those two aspects. Now, to the uninitiated, that just sounds really stupid. Actually, it sounds like you're talking some kind of total nonsense. And, you know, for other people, for people in, you know, that they're in popular culture who are reading their daily horoscope and it says Venus is trine Neptune, so you might a good day for romantic relationships, they might love that, right? So I think with the, you know, the astrology haters, it's a response partly to the language and then the idea that people think their lives are ruled by the stars. So I'll tell you about, right, Theodor Adorno. Not many people know that name. He was a German sociologist, Marxist, who fled Germany and ended up living in the USA. And he wrote a book called The Stars Down to Earth. And his argument there was that astrology is a gateway to fascism. And the argument runs like this. Astrologers think they are controlled by a higher power. Fascists like to be controlled by a higher power. Therefore, astrology is a gateway to fascism. So that was the simple argument. And that kind of argument, that kind of assumption that astrology is somehow dangerous to democracy, runs through some of the sociological and scientific critiques of astrology.
And today, just embarking a little bit in the subject, Nick, it's very polarized these days, right? I was watching some of your interview with Chris Brennan, and we're talking about the polarization of politics. And Chris mentioned, and I agree with him, I tend to think that I see more astrologers left wings than right wings these days, and how biased it can become. And it's an interesting conversation too. So any thoughts about that these days?
Okay. Yeah, I do think modern astrologers tend to be social liberals and broadly on the left. It's not always been completely like that. For example, I'll tell you an anecdote about an astrologer friend of mine that I've repeated elsewhere. This person in the late 60s got into astrology through the counterculture, very much hippie-ish person, a lovely person, a really good friend who I've worked with. Anyway, she told me she went along to a conference of the American Federation of Astrologers around the late 60s, 1970 or something. And she went along, in her best hippie clothes and found everybody there in business suits, right? Because that's who they were. The women in, shoulder pads and stuff, and the men in suits and ties. And so they weren't left wing at all. And an example of one astrologer who comes out of that cultural context was Joan Quigley, who became Ronald Reagan's astrologer. Joan Quigley was a good Republican voter. And so it was very natural for her to work for Ronald Reagan. But, if we go back in history, you can sometimes see astrologers adopting political points of view. Like there was in England in the 1640s, there was a huge civil war. The king was executed, and then a republic was declared for 10 years. And a lot of astrologers at that time were radicals. They actively supported the rebels against the king. So that went badly afterwards. And there's a radical tradition in early 19th century astrology as well, late 18th, early 19th century astrology, where astrologers supported the American rebels against the British. And then the modern spiritual astrology, that astrology is spiritual self-awareness, is largely founded by a man called Alan Leo, who wrote the first great series of textbooks on astrology in English in the modern times. Anyway, he thought that one way to understand astrology was through the law of karma. Right, so we come into this life carrying our baggage from former lives. And he came to the conclusion that there must be a law of karma, because he saw the way that some people at that time, around 1890, 1900, lived in, he was in Scotland in the north of Britain. Some people lived in extreme poverty and other people were very wealthy. And so he regarded that as a huge injustice. So his response to that was to say, well, the people living in poverty have got bad karma. But he didn't think they were destined to live in poverty. He saw, he believed in the coming spiritual new age of Aquarius, and he thought the purpose of astrology was to hasten the coming of the new age. And that would be that could come about if everybody was spiritually enlightened. So that was his recipe for ending poverty. But he was a radical in that sense, that he he thought that, you know, astrology should, one of its functions should be to help remove injustice.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are different levels to this question.
Yeah, and there is a danger, isn't it, Nick, to be biased with the aspects that we have in the sky, and is it possible not to be? I don't know. We try to be, you know, as you know what the aspect means, and people can twist to, you know, their opinions or their hopes.
You mean when they're doing astrology readings?
Yes, and also mundane astrology too. Talking about mundane astrology. Oh, sorry. I was meant to ask you how hard was to do this. The Nick has for the audience this amazing book,
Yeah.
the Book of the World Horoscopes.
Yeah.
And look at this, and all the charts of
Yeah.
so many countries. Can you elaborate a little bit about that, Nick? How was that? Because it's such an historic
Okay.
journey
I'll tell you
too.
how I got into that. So, you know, I love history. Okay. And astrologers were claiming that you could look at a country's astrology through its birth chart or its horoscope. And usually the horoscopes that were reproduced for badly researched or fictitious moments, or moments which had no significance. That kind of annoyed my historical sense. And then people would talk about the birth chart of a country. And I would think, how can a country have a birth chart? A country isn't born. You know, a country as a political unit is the result of a huge amount of evolution and cultural and historical and social, you know. So I thought this kind of level of debate kind of annoys me. So, okay, if you're going to use inaccurate horoscopes, but claim that the time that when an event happens is important, then I find that annoying. Actually, be honest. What you can say, if you like, is I just made up this old horoscope, and it works. Okay, you know, that's fine. But if you're going to say the time when an event happens is important, stick to that. So we're going back to the second half of the 1980s, so 84, 85, 86. And I just got this bug about researching times for countries' horoscopes. And of course, you know, we're going way before the internet. I spent, I can't remember how long, months in the British Library in London looking at reference books. And for more recent charts, the British Library used to have a newspaper library, and it had, you know, newspapers for everywhere and every time, and I'd go and read the newspapers, and the newspapers would often say, you know, 2:30 something happened, you know. So my principle with that book, I just wanted to provide the data, and I just wanted to say, look, to astrologers, if you say that the time when something happened is important, follow that through. Be serious about it. Otherwise, stop saying that. So the result was that collection. And of course, because there's no such thing as a birth chart for a country, there's no birth chart for the USA or for, you know, the United Kingdom or for France or Russia. You just follow through, a series of events. You have to decide what's significant about those events.
How do you think today, Nick? Do you think it's what's your conclusion? Like, do you see?
My conclusion is that some of those charts have a powerful narrative quality, and some don't. So I think that, in some cases, you've got an event, and the symbolic reading of a chart for that event from the horoscope is can be quite rich. And by the way, I want to just say something else here about the business of horoscopes. Horoscopes can be constructed on the different kinds of bases. Okay, so the first horoscope for the United States was published by the English astrologer Ebenezer Sibley in 1794. For that horoscope, he set the planets for July the 4th, 1776, which is when the wording of the Declaration of Independence of the American colonies was agreed. So set the planets for then, but we don't know what time that happened. He didn't know the time. So he took the ascendant and the midheaven and the two other angles for the previous summer solstice, so for July 21st, 1776. And he mixed them up. So there we've got a horoscope that is based on two different astronomical events, right? So because a lot of astrologers didn't understand that, then a whole mythology developed about this being a horoscope for the time of American independence. So it's a symbolic chart.
Mostly
So
used, right, Nick? The Sibley chart is the most used. I also use it.
Yeah, but there's different variants on the Sibley chart. Okay, that the one that goes for the early morning is based on Sibley himself, has Gemini rising. And then there's a Sagittarius rising chart. But you see, neither of them is based on an actual event. So within astrology, there is a whole other current of practice in which horoscopes can be, symbolic alone, right? So they do not need to be based on actual events. So anyway, this was why I created the book World Horoscopes. I didn't just because I felt that sort of debate in astrology, that difference, was just not being acknowledged. And astrologers constantly rush ahead to do things. They do astrology without being aware of the complex debates, positions, attitudes, cosmologies, worldviews that actually are expressed through the totality of astrological literature and practice, which comes back to why I love the history of astrology, because I love getting all that stuff out.
And in that sense, Nick, for mundane astrology, that's when the great conjunctions play a big role, right? Because it's in the sky, the big conjunctions among the slow planets, slow-moving planets. Then we can all agree at the time and, in the sky, and it does represent, you can see the big changes.
Yeah.
The Saturn-Pluto one, and what's your feeling for the Saturn Neptune coming in 2026, Nick? Any thoughts? Any reflections?
Well, I hadn't really thought about it. I'm so busy running the program,
Teaching some.
and in between trying to write all my historical work. But okay, here's an intriguing pattern. So André Barbeau, who was one of the most prominent, famous French astrologers of the 20th century, died a couple of years ago. He said that the Saturn Neptune conjunction is an important feature of communist Russia, the Soviet Union. So in 1917, there was a Saturn Neptune conjunction. And then Stalin died in 1953 under a Saturn Neptune conjunction. So André Barbeau said, aha, that's a repetition.
89, right, Nick, with the Berlin Wall?
Exactly. So he said that's a repetition. And so he said Saturn Neptune relates to, broadly speaking, Soviet history. And it was after then. So, he wrote that. I think it was the late 60s, probably. Anyway, so then he says that, and then 1989, there's another Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and the Soviet Union collapses. Berlin Wall opens, Cold War in Europe comes to an end. So it's a kind of fulfillment of Barbeau's pattern. So you see, if we look at the next Saturn-Neptune conjunction, if Barbeau had a pattern, then the Soviet Union no longer exists. So does that mean that that pattern has played itself out? So in other words, right, here's an important point of view on astrology, which I think you find in the Neoplatonic writings of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Basically saying that the archetypes do not always manifest. Right? So you can take the view on the great conjunctions that there's always going to be a manifestation. And that would be the point of view you get from the great Persian texts, which began this whole tradition, by the way. Persian texts being translated into Arabic in the 700s, 800s. There's always a correlation with like the Saturn Jupiter conjunction. But the Neoplatonic philosophers had said, an archetype does not always manifest. So there's a view that you could look forward at an upcoming Saturn Neptune conjunction and say nothing about it, right? But you might take the view, as a Neoplatonist would have done, that this is an auspicious moment for personal, philosophical, psychic renewal. So is it, they would then say, not what's going to happen in the world, but what does the quality of the time say about me? So, I think that you came back to the idea of bias, right? So astrologers, I think, in the way they write about such things politically, there's a lot of wish fulfillment.
And it could we also, I wish how they wish that it happens.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if André Barbeau also could have had a wider also view on not only Russia, but communism and capitalism, or this left and right balance. And I don't know.
Carry on, sorry.
No, and I was just thinking if, how we can expect a balance between those two.
Yeah, well, so his reading was Neptune is compassion and Saturn is structure. So Saturn Neptune is then structured compassion. So expressed through socialism in general, expressed through socialism. Why? Because socialists like structure and control, as opposed to people on the right who want to, opposed to state power, unless they're implementing it. So so that was his view. So yes, there could be something wider, but I here's my broader view on astrology, right? Which is that it can become a mistake to fixate on the labels, right? So astrologers meet each other. Oh, they all have a conversation. I've got Mercury in Taurus. Oh, my Venus is in Taurus. It's squared Saturn. Oh no, I've got the Saturn in Gemini. So there's a fixation with labels, right? And I think that can get in the way of understanding. It's supposed to be a way of understanding, but it can get in the way of it. So I'm going to quote the Neoplatonists again, Plotinus, 200s, 300s AD, who was deeply into the divinity of the stars. The stars, the planets, as a kind of divine consciousness with which we can connect. But he thought the casting of horoscopes was ridiculous, because you just get involved in first of all a load of number crunching, and then in all these labels. Venus is in the third decan of Cancer, in the fourth place, and it's in a opposition. You go on and on and on with the labels. So what I think about looking at politics is this. I think that the relationship between astrology and politics is absolutely fascinating. The astrological theories, right, is part of my love of the history of astrology. I'm just completely, and I love politics, so I'm completely fascinated by the ways that astrology is developed to look at politics. However, right, so there's all sorts of planetary conjunctions coming up, and cycles and squares and whatever. The question is, what do you do about it? What do you do in your personal life? What do you do in your political life? So me, I've always felt it's important to be politically active. And I'm not that active because I'm too busy with work. But for me, that's the point. You get out and you work in your community, if you can, to work for some better world, and to look at to obsess about upcoming planetary conjunctions is to then put yourself in a passive role. You think this is going to happen, that's going to happen. And the fact is that almost all astrological predictions are wrong. There are some astonishing examples of correct predictions, but almost all are wrong. Or if they're in detail, or they're just so vague, they mean nothing, and that's an honest look at the way in which astrologers talk about politics. So yeah, that's
I think it helps in a way that what you're saying, Nick, that I love how it engages in thinking about the aspects to come. I always say here in the channel, the open space for observing life and see how it manifests, and see how you co-create the sense of participation, how you co-create with the universe, and I think it inspires me to think and give space to life to manifest itself, right? Not try to control everything, because it's not helpful if you try to control everything. And
it can be, and I think that personal experience, that experiential view, is incredibly important. But when a lot of astrologers still look at every upcoming planetary conjunction and think it's going to lead to greater spirituality, right? To which I say, where? All you're talking about is your own community. You're not talking about poor, Uyghurs who are being expelled from land in Burma, or people suffering from the civil war in Sudan, or people living in poverty in some great slum. Who are you talking about when you say, oh, the world's going to become more more spiritual. So I think that, you can say for yourself, right, I can open up to a more spiritual space, and I actually think that's really important. But the way in which astrologers talk about, future conjunctions collectively, I think it's just a repetition, constant repetition.
And in their
of the
lives,
idea
right, Nick, there is this
something big is going to
ideal.
happen.
Yeah.
There's a big breakthrough going to happen anytime. And if we go back to the great age of when the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were, everybody paid attention to them. So we can go back to the 15th century in Europe and the 16th century. Everybody constantly thought Jesus was going to come back. Yeah, there's going to be the apocalypse. And they kept saying it. And of course, Jesus didn't come back. And so, it's the same. There's just a constant repetition of stuff. And I think that, you can make really, really, really brilliant predictions. So I'm going to quote Liz Green, who in her book, The Outer Planets and the Collective, which must have been published about 1980, she did look at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction and other aspects happening in 1989-90. And over about a page and a half to 2 pages of that book, she spelt out very unambiguously the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it can be done, but it requires thought, and it requires looking at patterns. It requires something more than just saying, oh, a big event is going to happen, or a new paradigm is going to happen. There's going to be a paradigm shift. Which is it's just so off piste for me. So look, one thing I'm constantly trying to say to the astrological community is, look at what you're saying. Look at the texts you're learning from. Look at how teachers teach you. Look at how you're reading a horoscope. Be aware. So there's a lot of, like talk in astrology about how astrology leads to self-awareness. But so what I'm saying is, be aware of what you say astrology is and how you're using it, and how you think you can use it.
Yeah. In the end, we are complex, right, Nick? And we biased again. What you're saying, that that's this ideal of what the conjunctions may bring, and this new era or this new paradigm, as much as was also talked a lot about in the 60s, right? The big conjunctions in Aquarius that everybody thought was going to be everything new, everything. We can resemble a little bit the 60s now because of this space exploration and all these themes that, come and go. But again, we are complex, going to be...
They're complex, and they're neither good nor bad. So, if you just mentioned space exploration, and that was one of the things when I was young, it was during the Apollo space program. And I watched all the American space shots live on television. I loved them. And then I watched live the first moon landing. I loved it. The next day, for me, the world had changed. There was a full moon at the moon landing. And I watched Neil Armstrong get out of his capsule live on television. And I went out and looked at the full moon. I tried to see him. I always thought I could see him. And the next day, it was an ordinary day. And I was 15. I went out around the local shops with my mother and stuff, and everybody seemed to be the same. I wanted to think, don't you know the world has changed? That was a moment. So I've got a fascination for outer space matters. But of course, now it's all moving so fast. And in one sense, it's wonderful. But, in another sense, it's business as usual, because we've got mining companies who want to blow up asteroids or mine the moon, and we've got the Americans and Chinese and the Russians, if they could afford it, sending up, military satellites. So it's kind of business as usual.
Yeah.
So that's why I
Humans
think
being human. Humans being human.
it's being human. It's
Yeah.
being human.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's in 1994, I published a book called The Great Year. And it was a history of ideas that there's about to be a big breakthrough. You know, any minute now, the Messiah is going to return, Jesus is going to return, the revolution is going to happen, the age of Aquarius is going to begin, and it just it's not going to happen. We've kind of got more of the same, which is fine.
Yeah, I keep repeating in the channel here, Nick, that apocalypse sells, right? And I try not to encourage this apocalyptical view because it's not a service to us.
Up to my my YouTube channel, you know, YouTube's an amazing thing because it can read your mind. You know,
Yeah.
like, how did it know I was interested in that? Up yesterday, in the middle of me watching some debate, popped some evangelical Christian prophecy that on the apocalypse is going to happen on October the 7th. So, you know, very soon, only a few weeks away. And there's all the proof, you know, bits of quote from the Book of Revelation, planetary lineups, everything that was said about the Book of Revelation was kind of not present in the Book of Revelation, but that doesn't matter, you know, because it's the prophecy. So this stuff is still going on and it's all around. And I made a, you know, I made a mental note to go back and watch the video because it could be good.
Share with me later if you can.
Right, you know.
We're towards the end, but I had this question here. If we have the time, maybe it's a big question, but I want to hear from you. Changing a little bit the subject again. Is the soul in the chart or not?
Well, yes, this is it's a subject of a lecture I gave at a conference only a few weeks ago. And yeah, is the soul or the self or the I in the chart, or is it independent? And it's something astrologers struggle with. A lot of astrologers. I mean, it's been a debate in astrology that goes back to the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle. And Plato had the idea of a transcendent soul that incarnates in the current body, but obviously that soul is always not in the body. And his student Aristotle thought everything was contained in the natural world. So, you know, you get two kinds of astrology that come out of that, really. You've got an astrology which talks about, you know, what you are like, still with there being an I, because there can always be an I, a self, even within that natural mix. So you can still say, you know, I can alter because there's still individual agency. You can still change things, as opposed to the idea there's a soul which is completely outside the chart and which means that the I, the self, the soul can then make completely, you know, independent choices. That's a very important view from medieval Christianity, by the way, and the Catholic Church, because it made astrology acceptable to a lot of Catholic theologians. If you said the soul cannot be ruled by the planets only rule the body. So great. So the answer, Denise, is I don't know, because while I love studying such questions, it's like you never get close to the answer. There's the same idea is that you know, you can never reach the end of your journey because you're always traveling. There's always some distance between you and the end of the journey. You never actually get there. It's a scientific conundrum. But anyway, so I think that I think we are put on this planet, or we're on this planet to think, because we are above all a thinking species, you know, and lots of other animals think, maybe plants think, but in the latest research. But, you know, we're put here to think, but we don't have to get the answers. It's the process of thinking that is part of being human.
That's the beauty of it. It's lovely answer, Nick. Nick, for the ones listening to us that are interested in, the May, interested in learning more, any words, I will put some links in the description to encourage people to know more about, this amazing
Put some
journey.
links in. You should put in my my university email address. You can use that
Okay,
and then I can be the first contact.
yeah,
But yeah, or people can search for MA Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. They'll always find it. But it's also good to contact me because then I can send out full information.
great. Nick, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. It was lovely to have you. Appreciate the time, the thoughts, the knowledge that you shared with us today. Thank you so much.
Been a real pleasure, Denise.
Thank you everyone who was watching. Until now, see you in the next video. Thank you so much.